Hi everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Avery. My presentation is a little bit unconventional due to the fact that it's a pre-recorded video, but I thought that for this topic, a video would work best because I would be able to get my point across more clearly. So, anyways, without further ado, let's discuss this research paper, which witch is which. I guess before I give an explanation as to why I chose this topic and the sources I used, it would serve the paper well to briefly summarize it. So, to be brief, this essay, what it is an examination of how the witch has changed throughout pop culture from its origins to actually being a real life type of people to the classic green witch that we all know and love to whatever the new modern witch is. For the paper as a whole, I presented the idea that the witch has actually changed throughout the years, actually due to the increase of feminist movements. What that means is as the feminist movements evolved, so too did the witch. I chose four pieces of witch pop culture to examine, which were The Wizard of Oz, Bewitched, Harry Potter, and more recently, 2021's WandaVision. What's really interesting about all four of these properties is that they do deal with witches, however, they do not deal with the same type of witch. That is where I presented the idea that there's actually four subcategories of witches. Those categories are the classic witch, like the one seen in The Wizard of Oz, the attractive witch, like the one that was seen in Bewitched, the intelligent witch, like Hermione from Harry Potter, and more recently, the modern witch, like we're currently seeing in WandaVision. Since the modern witch deals with WandaVision as a primary source, unfortunately that means that slight spoilers will probably be discussed. However, if you want to avoid that, you can just skip over that part and you should be fine. It's right after I finish talking about the intellectual witch, Hermione, so if you skip to the end, you'll be fine. So the idea I ran with is that these witches were a reflection of their time, and argued that these characters actually served as metaphors, if you will, for how feminism was perceived during that time. And to further that point a bit more, what's interesting about the witch from The Wizard of Oz, if you really examine her and look at her character, there's nothing to her whatsoever. She's just there to be evil. And the argument I presented was actually that the witch from The Wizard of Oz represented the way that men would have viewed the feminist movement in the 1930s, as it was often met with hostility. And when women were trying to fight for their rights, men would often say something like they were being hysterical or just plain crazy. So skip ahead a few decades later, and it's the 60s, and the 60s is a time of rapid change in movement. You got Kennedy as elected, later assassinated, the Beatles stormed North America, and then in the very late 60s, the Apollo landings happened. Anyways, also in 1964, Bewitched aired, which was a show about a witch. However, the difference was that this witch was actually attractive for the first time ever. And that's the point that I really emphasized that by this point, feminism was starting to gain momentum. However, it wasn't really there yet. So, unfortunately, people perceived it wrongly and assumed that by making the witch beautiful, that meant that women were strong. But in reality, that's not the case. It just sexualized the witch, I guess, if you want to use that word. Um, but yeah, as a whole, it just made the witch an object. Thankfully, that ideology started to change in the late 90s, early 2000s. And by that point, we're introduced to Hermione Granger from Harry Potter. And Hermione is a different type of witch. She's not an ugly witch by any means, but the difference is that Hermione's brilliant. And that's really Hermione's strongest trope as a character is that she uses her intelligence. And it's not just there for show, it's actually earned, and as a result, she becomes a really strong female figure by the end of the series. While I would technically consider Hermione, in a way, she is a modern witch, but I would say that it's been furthered now even more in most recently WandaVision, which is actually about a superhero that's a witch that's also an Avenger at the same time. So it's kind of a weird combo, but yet it works. But in the process of actually making the show also establishes what a modern witch is capable of. But at the same time, it also proves how strong a female figure of power, like a witch, can actually be and how much it has evolved since the days of the classic witch. In all honesty, I had no idea where this paper was going at first. I just knew, hey, I like witches and I also like pop culture. Is there a way I can combine them together? So, after a bunch of research and watching a bunch of old witch sitcoms like Bewitched, um, I realized that I kind of like the idea of combining pop culture and the witch and then talking about how they've evolved over time. So the hardest part about this project actually was that considering it was a passion project, connecting everything and staying on track was a bit difficult at times. There's a lot of information here, and the argument can be quite lengthy, so many parts required multiple rewrites as a result of that. I think if I was given the chance to continue with this, I'd love to further examine what the modern witch is and how she connects to witchcraft in general. Um, that witch fascinated me the most out of all four because, for the most part, it's unknown, and that this type of witch is essentially a reboot of what came before. She rejects so many attributes of the witches prior to her, yet at the same time, she holds on to enough to still be considered a witch. However, even though she is a witch, I kept questioning how she was a witch. And at the end of it, I figured out something really important, that this type of witch is purely subjective. She is what you want her to be. So, like myself, I view her as a witch, yet others may not. They may view this as an excuse for a witch and just a boring, bland, modern interpretation of a witch. So, at the end of the day, the question is, what do you think? As a whole, I would argue that this does connect to class quite a bit, even though you would think it wouldn't, as we're talking about witches in pop culture. But each idea for each witch comes from somewhere. So, like the saying goes, every myth has its roots in history, so too does every piece of pop culture. So, each witch, while they differ in many ways, all of them do connect back to the real life witch that would have existed in a place like Scotland. All right, hopefully I'm not over time, so I'll wrap it up here. Before I do, I just like to say that while this was a brutal essay to finish, I won't lie, it was also a lot of fun to write. Um, I can no longer look at witches the same in pop culture anymore, so I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but we'll wait and see. However, at the end of the day, I'll say this. After looking at how much the witch has changed throughout the years, I can't help but wonder what's next. Thanks for listening.